Welcome back from the break, and I hope you enjoyed meeting old colleagues in person again after spending more than 2 years in Zoom meetings. And welcome to this session on IPCC, and it is indeed a great pleasure to welcome 3 co-chairs from the 3 working groups. Valérie Masson-Delmotte, Working Group 1, Hans Portner, Working Group 2, and Jim Ski, Working Group 3. And as you know, they have been extremely busy over the last year with 3 intense approval meetings and also a lot of outreach afterwards. And we have asked them to share some reflections on how scenarios were used in the reports and also some reflections on what we've learned and what we can do better in the next cycle. So as you can see, this cycle has been very busy with 3 special reports and the 3 working group reports and 1 remaining synthesis report. During the writing of the special reports, I think we can say that IPCC developed new ways of working together. We worked across the 3 working groups in these 3 special reports, and we brought that mode of working with us when we started the 3 working group reports, the writing of these reports. And they are now, as you know, approved and published, and we will hear from the co-chairs about their experience. So by that, I give the floor to Valérie from Working Group 1. Please, Valérie.
Thank you very much, and first of all, huge thanks to each of you and for you as a community for supporting the work of the IPCC. And scenarios are, of course, critical for future climate simulations. Scenarios are used in the AR6 as a key cross-working group dimension of integration, in addition to global warming levels that allow to bring together climate model results using different types of scenarios. And it's particularly critical for the handshake between working groups 1 and 2, as well as cumulative CO2 emissions. And there has been strong work to improve the consistency of the estimates of remaining carbon budgets across the working groups 1 and 3 reports. Regarding the use of scenarios in the Working Group 1 report, it was one of the most touchy topics during our approval of our summary for policymakers to just find the right way of describing them. There were strong objections to use the terms core scenarios or even SSPs for the Working Group 1 approval session. So we described them as illustrative scenarios that cover the range of possible future development of anthropogenic drivers of climate change found in the literature. A major advance is a broader range of greenhouse gas, land use and air pollutant futures. The aspect related to the emissions of short-lived climate forces was really important in one of our chapters, focused on that aspect and the role of emissions associated with future changes in air quality. Still, it was challenging to bring together these advances with the health assessments in the Working Group 2 reports, because this approach was not completely percolating in the impact studies. The assessment of Working Group 1 is also illustrated here, where you see for the 5 SSPs how they are cited in the full report, how they are cited in the technical summary, in the summary for policymakers. You can see that we tried to have a balanced approach in the summary for policymakers, but modeling efforts are more strongly focused on some of the SSP scenarios, in particular, the one that leads to the largest forcing, which is always attracting to understand the behavior of climate or ice sheet models, to shock them with the largest possible forcing. The outcomes and the assessment is also limited by the amount of climate simulations that have been performed for one or another type of scenarios. And you can maybe see here that we had fewer models run with the lowest emission scenarios for the assessment. When presenting the report findings, the recurrent question was always about the plausibility of the scenarios. And of course, this is not assessed in the working group 1. We described that the high-end scenarios are considered in the literature to be less plausible, but we cannot go further than that. Regarding the various chapters of the report, they are presented here for the occurrences of SSPs and RCPs. You can see that, of course, in the chapter focused on global climate projections, SSPs and the new CMIP6 climate projections are given a strong weight. It's also the case for the chapter on short-lived climate forces and the ocean and cryosphere. But if you look at chapters focused on regional climate information, many of the Cordex regional projections are built on RCP scenarios, and therefore they are given a larger weight in terms of occurrences in the chapters focused on regional climate information. One aspect that emerged is also sometimes a confusion related to the labeling of the scenarios, when successive scenarios have the same labeling for radiative forcing, but in fact lead to a higher forcing. So when looking at emulator results for the RCPs and SSPs, you can see a different range. And regarding climate model results, half of the increase in simulated warming comes from a higher climate sensitivity in some of the CMIP6 reports, but also half of that arises from higher radiative forcing in nominally corresponding scenarios. And that is a source of confusion for the outside world when dealing with scenarios that have the same labeling. A major advance in the Working Group 1 report has been the ability to narrow the range of climate sensitivity through the combination of multiple lines of evidence and through review work done and coordinated by the World Climate Research Programme. So that information, together with advances in observational constraints to projections, have been used to assess future global temperature change. So for the first time, it's not the raw projections that are reported, but the outcome of constrained projections. And an outcome of that work is the availability of physically constrained emulators that have been used as a key dimension of integration together with Working Group 3. So emulators are used to assess global surface temperature, ocean warming, and global mean sea level in a consistent way. Other types of emulators are also used for patterns of changes in our chapter of extreme events. Another dimension of the Working Group 1 work, beyond scenarios, is the development of physical climate storylines, in particular related to low or unknown probability, but high impact outcomes. For instance, what if the climate sensitivity is in the upper range of what has been assessed, so high warming storylines? What about the triggering of Antarctic ice sheet instability associated with deep uncertainty? And this is even reflected in our SPM. What if several major volcanic eruptions occur, and what would be the implications? This is not well reflected as an integration across the various working groups due to the lack of literature, and might be really important for future advances. And finally, I would like to flag what I see as a couple of limitations. Limited scenarios and projections and impact studies focused on overshoot. There was only one scenario available for that, with about a 1 degree overshoot. It was used in the Working Group 1 report to look at physical climate reversibility or irreversibility. But there is a gap for lower amounts of overshoots, and in particular across Working Groups 1 and 2 regarding irreversibility for cryosphere consequences. I also see a challenge regarding the integration of hard limits from a changing climate in scenarios. Working Group 2 flags hard limits for adaptation due to water availability after snow has melted and glaciers have retreated. But this is not fully integrated in the use of water in scenarios. The IPCC IPBES workshop has flagged challenges associated with a climate biodiversity interface regarding the potential use of biomass and space available for forests. I also see an inconsistency between the physical climate modeling on carbon feedbacks, where we see a loss of efficiency of natural carbon sinks after basically 2 degrees of warming, while Working Group 2 flags ecosystem degradation, biological processes affecting terrestrial carbon sinks in the range from 1.5 to 2 degrees. And I think that's really important to better understand the carbon cycle reactions. And we also tried to advance the coordination across working groups to go beyond an approach of CO2 equivalent. This led to an emphasis on the benefits of methane mitigation, not just for peak warming, but also for ozone formation and air quality. I still see that there is a limited integration across the working groups, and advances are needed to better address the air quality mitigation interface. And finally, of course, we were all struggling with the reactivity dimension of scenario updates. Some ad hoc scenarios were adjusted regarding the impact of lockdowns at the beginning of the pandemic, purely for the aspects related to climate responses. And of course, the situation about the war in Ukraine is also triggering lots of questions when we release the report findings about the plausibility of scenarios. So that's something really important for considering not just the assessments that we make, but how we can provide information related to shocks or surprises. Thank you.
And then we keep the questions for the discussions after the 3 presentations. So please, Hans, Working Group 2.
Thanks a lot, Jan, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here, being massaged a little bit by a charming Working Group 1 Vice Chair, who I called a charming slave driver, actually. And so thanks a lot for the opportunity. And to add to this very systematic talk by Valerie, I could simply say scenarios have been used in a very non-systematic way in the Working Group 2 report. And because the scenarios were really applied to case studies across sectors and systems, but there isn't really contribution of scenarios yet to a coherent picture. There are benefits, definitely, to use those scenarios. And let me start with what we said at the end of our 2019 presentation to your meeting, where we participated virtually, where scenarios should land, and they should bridge to the understanding of our stakeholders. And I think what Valerie just said in terms of discussions at the Working Group 1 approval, that there are certain limitations to that, linked to different climate futures. We are improving on that, but with respect to impact studies and impact modeling studies, this differentiation could still be improved. And if we move to solution options and their capacities to reduce risk, I think we are just at the beginning of our understanding to develop some modeling approaches here to help this, and I will try and show some examples for that. And where we are completely insufficient, I think, is in the link to governance and institutions. So my view would be that or a vision would be that we need a systems view when we integrate these different approaches and when using scenarios, because otherwise we might develop a misleading picture of the future if we just focus on specific sectors or if we just focus on certain patterns of economic development. So the question for me would be whether current approaches are comprehensive enough. And that brings me to a synthetic figure which we had in our Working Group 2 report, where we were in a plastic way describing the current imbalance with climate change being caused by human society influencing ecosystems and biodiversity at the same time, and describing these basic interactions where we have negative ones that are pushing us out of our balance and in a way out of our future, and where we have positive interactions that we should and would want to strengthen. And this would include human health, species health, ecosystem health, and in a way a summarizing term for that could be planetary health, although the understanding of that term is a little bit limited at the moment and confined to the human health issue. But it has the relationships strengthened between human system and its capacity to adapt to and mitigate climate change, and also ecosystems supporting adaptation, mitigation trends, and also human society being able to conserve and restore. And all of this is captured in our overarching concept of climate resilient development, where we have trajectories conceptualized, but not really integrated into any scenario work. I think where we see some beginning with respect to the use of scenario work is in the context of assessing risks and evaluating risks, considering the capacity for adaptation. And you're probably familiar with this propeller diagram where risk is being evaluated from the overlap of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, and where the risk can be surface in a way in this depiction can be constrained by adaptation measures, but also the limits to adaptation need to be considered, and the list of terms that is under this limits to adaptation term here is already indicating how complex the situation is with respect to the various aspects integrating into this. And we have a common language, the burning ember diagrams, which is a semi-quantitative way of describing risks and how they develop from undetectable to moderate to high and very high, using a color code from white to yellow to red to purple. And this is, I think, a major progress from the AR5 to AR6, that we have widened this approach very much in the AR6, and are now looking at risk assessments in different sectors and systems, which in the end we can then also evaluate whether we see any common principles in there. So now the trajectories that we would like to know, and where we are missing really the scenario modeling yet, for example, can be seen here in this conceptual graph from our SPM, from the Special Report on Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate, where you see how the risk development follows a trajectory in principle of sea level rise, but this risk trajectory can be modified by the capacity for adaptation as well as mitigation. So both need to be integrated in a comprehensive picture. And doing this and trying to do this very systematically is exemplified here in this example, which is one of the very few where actually SSP work has been integrated in studying risk development, and it makes a huge difference in terms of its different adaptation efforts and how the risks develop for the health different health sectors indicated here: morbidity, mortality, ozone-related mortality, malaria, and other diseases. And Chris Seaby, who has been behind this, can tell you all about the details of this. I won't go into this after this. Now, from our own work, I can say, is certainly we are seeing improvements in the scenario work with respect to spatial resolution, but we can certainly and have to improve. And here you see the improvement we've seen over recent years from the AR4 to the AR5, then AR6, in terms of spatial resolution for ocean and coastal ocean modeling, so that in our present projections we can even resolve for our island states that we have in Europe and the European coastlines and the coastal ocean that is here. And there's further progress ahead with respect to the bottom right figure And this is representing the physical climate parameters with this spatial resolution, and very valuable to have that if you want to do the respective projections for impacts. And another improvement in resolution for the ocean that gives you just an impression is how to, for example, also resolve for ocean eddies, which are also influencing ocean biology. But all of this impacts work that is or can be connected to this in terms of scenario work is still ahead of us. So this spatial resolution and also resolution for time is important. It is very deficient currently in the Working Group 2 assessment reports. And so there is a bright future and a lot to be developed. Then just to indicate that with respect to the impacts, where we are missing the full trajectories, for example, is the heat-induced habitat change and loss for species in the marine realm, and it is also this is for the marine species, but by analogy, similar principles work for species on land. And this is also, and this is summarized here in terms of species loss, habitat losses under potentially dangerous climate conditions, and how this is expanding under different futures. And this is the kind of work that needs to be expanded. But what is important as well, and needs to be emphasized, that we need a process understanding. And Valerie has indicated already that Working Group 2 has highlighted some process understanding that will be important to include in the scenarios work. So in this context, for example, it would be the interaction between heat stress, human thermal performance, and actually then societal performance. Do we have a quantitative understanding for that? And I would say no, we don't. And that limits our understanding of vulnerability of human society at regional scales. And we also need environmental criteria for human well-being and health. Depending on ecosystem health, we need to connect the different sectors, including biodiversity, with a baseline question: does this match a human health criteria? So integrating human, ecosystem, and planetary health into a more realistic whole world scenario would be my wishful thinking, and that we go beyond anthropocentric views. And this takes us to the finalized and very integrative picture of climate resilient development, where we have a semi-quantitative connection to different climate futures, where we have already said that some adaptation options are no longer available because climate change has progressed, and in order to keep options open as much as possible, mitigation needs to make an effort to keep global warming to or close to 1.5, and that this will be setting the pace for the future. But I am not aware of any modeling or scenario work that is currently here, and it's a huge integration effort that will be needed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hans. And the final presentation from the working groups, Jim Ski, please.
Yeah, I've got a modest proposal for the 7th cycle, is that we renumber the working groups so that the mitigation working group always gets more than -2 minutes to make its presentation. That is just a modest little one there. What I'm going to do, does it move on? Okay, I'm going to move through this very quickly, but just 3 things. What was the Working Group 3 approach to what governments made us call modelled global emission pathways in AR6? Some of the issues that Shukla and I, my fellow co-chairs, think arise from what happened there, and then very briefly looking forward a bit, and particularly to the scenarios workshop, which I won't spend a lot of time on because it will also be covered later. So this is K1's slide, and it basically summarises the approach to scenarios. There is an AR6 scenarios database hosted by IIASA, which is now live and online. There were about 3,000 scenarios submitted to it. After vetting and screening, it's now down to about 1,200 scenarios in all. This was looking for compatibility with observed historic trends and the ability to turn them into climate outcomes. Basically, two analytical approaches to the database. One, to run the emission scenarios through climate emulators and then categorize them according to climate outcomes, which is illustrated by the two graphs at the bottom of the slide. And then the other one was to select 5 illustrative mitigation pathways, which demonstrated different mitigation strategies for getting to kind of Paris-compatible style ambition. So sort of two parallel approaches. And I think one debate you might have is what the balance of these approaches might be and the policy relevance that comes out of them. One other thing that we really tried to do in this report is to raise the level of transparencies around scenarios and modelling. So there is a separate annex in the report on scenarios and modelling, which I think does the job that it was required to do in helping modellers actually understand each other better. But as very clear from the approval session, governments don't read annexes. So I think there's a challenge about communicating that in different ways. So turning quickly to issues, and I've divided them into 3 kind of categories. One is about the scenario universe. And this is quite a challenging slide because it shows which modelling families contributed to the AR6 database. So very clearly, 2 models contributed nearly half of the scenarios, 5 models contributed more than 3/4, and all of these models are European-based, and I suspect that many of the model runs were actually funded by the European Union, which brings us on to issues that come up with government questions about whether there is the right kind of diversity in the scenario set. And I think that is a big challenge to be thought about, this question of diversity. Next slide shows something that's very different from Carol's presentation before the break. This is the SSP coverage in the AR6 database, and more than 90% of them are SSP2. And the rest are roughly split between SSP1 and then SSP3 to 5 taken together. And this is a bit unfortunate because one of the messages we were also qualitatively trying to convey with the Working Group 3 report was that incremental change is not enough and you need fundamental systemic change. And with more attention to SSP1, I think we could have made that case more strongly and built up stronger lines of evidence behind that argument. Fortunately, there was enough in there to get an illustrative mitigation pathway based on SSP1, so we could tell a story around that. But this question of diversity, I think, is quite challenging. Issues raised by governments, and we've heard these both at the approval session itself and in Bonn last week at the last 2 weeks at the meeting of the subsidiary bodies. So a big sort of concerns from like-minded developing countries about what they see to be the lack of considering equity issues in the scenarios. And quite frankly, some of the governments have argued for scenarios that are much more based on historic responsibility considerations rather than the outcomes that result from global least cost approaches. That's something to be thought about. Some of the scenarios in the database that are compatible with 1.5 degrees do not reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions within the 21st century. And the small island developing states have raised the issue that this is not compatible with Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, which requires the balance between sources and sinks. And it was required at the approval session that this scenario category was divided into 2 parts according to whether it hit net zero GHG within the 21st century or did not. I'll just say one thing, but many governments are concerned about comparing things like AR6 with previous reports, and we actually, during the Bonn sessions, had to respond to a request from Patricia Espinosa's office for something that she didn't entirely understand. I did want to flag also that the divergence between national emission inventories submitted by governments and the emissions in many of the models. There's a 5 gigaton difference globally at the moment. And this issue has been raised, particularly it came up from South Africa and Brazil in Bonn as out of concern about reaching conclusions about timing of net zero. And I know that Carl is interested in this, but paying attention to different likelihood levels, not just 50% or the likely 67% level might be interesting. And I think the small island developing states have also raised that. Just quickly, process issues. And the critical bit of that is the limited amount of time that the authors in the relevant chapter of our report had to process the database and get it submitted. And that compressed timetable really had, I think, a lot of difficulties. The literature cut-off date was the 11th of October. The report was submitted on the 28th of November. And there was a tremendous amount of analytical work that had to go into that. One of the reasons is waiting for the climate emulators coming from Working Group 1. And just to acknowledge the huge help that Working Group 3 got from Working Group 1 during this process. And just to say that delay, I mean, because of the compressed process, there were errors that crept into some of the analysis, and that meant that revisions were made to the database prior to the approval session and even during the approval session. And I can tell you 1 or 2 stories over a glass of beer about some of the things that were said about that during the approval session. And the other thing about doing this quite late, it makes it much more difficult to socialise scenarios across the other chapters of the Working Group 3 report. So these are the kind of things that struck Shukla and I about the issues arising from the process. Now, I'm not going to talk about this at any length, but just to say the workshop that all of the Working Group co-chairs have proposed to take place before the end of the 6th cycle has 2 kind of aims that have been signed off by governments. And just to say governments care about this, we proposed it as an expert meeting. They raised it to a workshop, which means that government nominations will be made for participants in the workshop. So scientific aims are very important. And I think the key one is probably the 3rd bullet about building on the RCP SSP framework. And just to say, governments, I think, have been very confused by the number of acronyms flying around. And it was very striking at the Working Group 1 approval that the governments just cut through it and called the scenarios very low, low, medium, high, and very high to simplify it. And there are some lessons here about how to communicate with policymakers. And just on the process side, just a couple of things there. But the first one is, as Valerie says, continue the cross-working group collaboration. And the second one is, I think, is quite important, this question of the boundary between assessment and research and how that is looked after. And the way that the scenario data is curated is something that the government's thoroughly endorsed. And finally, the question of the diversity of contributors to the scenario building processes and how that could be improved. I'll skip the last slide with my personal views and draw it to an end there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Yes, and now we open for discussion and questions from the floor, and also questions from the co-chairs. So I see a hand from Claudia. She is looking after the online questions. Okay, so yeah.
I'm Claudia Tebaldi. I want to pick up from the last slide about the expert meeting. I was wondering if it wouldn't make more sense to have it at the beginning of AR7 with the new co-chairs, with you guys, of course, there as well. But I was wondering, given the way IPCC works and sometimes the lack of institutional memory, if it wouldn't be more valuable to have the new chairs, witness to these discussions and given all the challenges that you guys have put on the table.
Thank you, and we take a couple of more questions, and you can prepare your answers here on the podium. Are there more questions here? Yeah, I see Detlef, please, and I see a hand there. Detlef.
Yes, so my My question is related to the presentation of Valerie and Hans, and both argue to have more feedbacks into the scenarios, the whole scenarios that, as Hans mentioned them. And so actually this was a choice that we have to make when we were developing the SSPs and RCPs, whether we would include these feedbacks or not. And if we do include them, and then you have to assume a climate sensitivity, a specific value, well, there is a whole range, and you have to assume a certain relationship between the impact and the level of climate change. And so you would make a very specific choice within a realm of uncertainty. And the alternative was to not include them, and then to hope that in all kinds of research in the literature, people would include them in specific research, and then they would enter still the assessment report. And we deliberately made that choice, that so not to include any feedbacks from the human system. We made one exception, which was the carbon cycle. There we found the feedback so important that the climate feedbacks on the carbon cycle were included. So you were now arguing maybe we should include them. I can see why it's important. At the same time, I still see this very strong methodological problems, because if somebody then wants to do an own study and has a different opinion on a climate sensitivity or on the relationship between health and temperature, he has to take it out somehow. And so what's your opinion on this? Because it is a very important dilemma how to do this best.
Thank you, Detlef. And the next question over there. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes. Stefano Battistoni, University of Zurich, Department of Banking and Finance. So I'd like to make a question that is related to one of the cross-cutting topics of this workshop, which is the use of scenarios. And so, because I work in climate finance, I would like to make you aware of a little bit of a disconnect that I feel, which is that when you talk to decision makers, in particular in finance, or those who have then put the money on the investments to fill the mitigation and adaptation gaps, there's a big question about the cost of inaction. And so I would like to pinpoint the following. So in this presentation has been said that, essentially the picture is emerging. Climate change and addressing climate change is a complex problem. There are multiple objectives, and I think this is well understood within this community. But when outside, in the outside world, when you talk to politicians and decision makers, they only see the economic aspect, and within economic, the monetary aspect. So I think there is something to think about fundamentally about the use of scenarios in order to deliver the message that dealing with climate change is not just about stating or estimating what is the monetary cost, because that is going to be typically law and in any case very, very uncertain. But that's not the way you make a decision about this complex problem. And there is a big disconnect between the world outside and I think and what these communities is the excellent work that this community is doing. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we already have 3 quite large questions. Can you wait until the next round? And then we have one question of the timing of the workshop, inclusion of feedbacks, and cost of inaction, and the disconnect between the two worlds. So perhaps on the workshop timing, Jim, would you like to start with that, and with additions from the others, if they... Yeah? Yeah.
Before the end of AR6 dealt with the group, there were some uncertainties about the conclusion of AR6, which is the difficulty. We've been running on the expectation it would be in the first quarter of 2023.
Okay, but and you see reasons for doing it in this cycle, not the start of the next cycle with a new chair, as Claudia asked.
Well, basically, so that the lessons of AR6 are not left. Under IPCC procedures, the actual division between the 6th cycle and the 7th cycle is actually quite sharp. The 6th cycle ends the moment the people from the 7th cycle are elected. And there is no formal overlap between them. Governments have discussed it in the past, but they've not dealt with it in this cycle. So, I mean, all I can kind of say is that, there are informal ways by which this knowledge can be transferred over. Personally, when Ottmar Edenhofer was co-chair in Working Group 5, he and his TSU were very generous about passing information over, and there's exactly the same will to do that, for moving over to AR7.
Thank you. And then we had a question on inclusion of feedbacks, and that is relevant for all the co-chairs, but I think Valerie can start that since she brought it up.
Yes, I fully understand the choice that was made at the beginning of the design of the scenarios. I was thinking that there might be a way to look at plausibility of some of the assumptions in the scenarios from the angle of climate change constraints, such as for biomass growth or water availability, as an intermediate approach. And just to share with you, when I was reviewing the Working Group 3 report, several times I was wondering, why is climate change so absent? And many of the chapters, and even the first drafts of the SPM, were basically written as if climate was not changing, apart from the increase of the cooling demand. So that's really a concern on we're not doing scenarios now as they were done in the 1990s. We're facing increases in losses and damages, costs of adaptation, and it's not fully reflected. So it was quite striking for me on that aspect. And the other dimension that is cross-cutting and not fully represented is the multiple climate impact drivers. That's really the new framework from Working Group 1 with 33 climate drivers and that knowledge. But much of the impact literature is focused on 1, 2, 3 of these aspects. Mean climate and heat extremes most of the time. So how to better make use of these multiple aspects, including for coastal hazards and risks. I think it's not completely there yet. And having in mind the first AR7 special report on cities and climate change, I would think that there's an opportunity to address multiple aspects, being closer to decision-making, better integration of adaptation, impacts, and mitigation at the scale of cities. And I see that as an opportunity to think of a different approach or improved approaches. And finally, the point about loss and damage, in a way, is really relevant. It was very hard to extract things that are really relevant for this discussion and making it more visible. I think there are ways forward to consider for making IPCC relevant for this dimension where negotiations are really not at pace with the suffering that is taking place.
Thank you. And I saw that Hans would like to add something.
Yeah, just to add, first of all, to the scenarios question. I mean, to the outside world, the scenarios are taken as a picture of reality. And if you have some technical reason for not including feedbacks, then you are deviating from reality. And I think it's as simple as that you want to have the key feedbacks in your approach. And I'm thinking especially of the limits, the hard limits of adaptation that are emerging from the biosphere. There is a very technical approach to CDR with respect to the use of the biosphere in the Working Group 3 report. It doesn't consider the subtleties and the limits that we are seeing at ecosystem level, and I think there could be some improvement on that side. I think that's all I would add to Valerie's point.
Briefly,
yeah. Could I just come back briefly on this costs of inaction, because there were 2 cross working group boxes in both Working Group 2 and 3 that tried to set mitigation of costs against the costs of impacts. And the thing is, with mitigation costs, it's very easy to pull them out of scenarios and take a scenario-based approach. But the costs of impacts relied on multiple lines of evidence, one of which was the other kind of integrated assessment model, the cost-benefit type, and they don't all come up with the same answers, and it is a real kind of problem. So the boxes did own up to the question of non-market damages as well, but I think this is something that needs a lot more discussion to pull it apart. It's relatively easy to get some numbers on the mitigation side. It's the costs of impacts that are much more challenging.
Thank you, Jim. And then we have a question there, and Kayvon, and I see a lot of hands. And yeah, let's start by...
Thank you. Eric Kempenedict, Stockholm Environment Institute. As an economist who focuses on the transition, a low carbon and sustainability transition, Jimsky's graph showing a huge SSP2 slice and a tiny SSP1 slice was a little depressing. But I understand that it's costly and time-consuming to do these models. And for Working Group 1, there's a need for high impacts to really push the system. For Working Group 3, there's a need to really look at the social and economic aspects of a major shift. And I just wondered if, given your experience, if you could comment on this, are there any lessons for AR7? Thanks.
We take one more question from Kevan and from there, and then we go to Claudia, who is monitoring the online questions. But Kevan next, and then over there. And we don't have much time, unfortunately, but please.
Yeah, so actually I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made, and also the direction in which we need to, I think, improve the scenarios. Some good news in the direction of perhaps the water and land constraints of the transformation. So most of the bigger integrated assessment models have been actually updated in the sense that they can take into account water constraints, they have biodiversity constraints, they have food constraints in there, and you can look at solutions which cost-effectively manage infrastructures across those three different areas. And I think a frontier is also where you basically have a localized version of the model which can really represent some of the local context also, and which is coupled to a bigger framework to understand what's also regionally needed. And you need to work with regional experts on this. But my question was, I was wondering, Jim, you brought up the issue of equity, and there were many comments by particularly one government, but I think the other developing countries perceived this in the same way, that there is not enough equity considerations explicitly put in the scenarios. Of course, there are implicit equity assumptions in there. And I was wondering, given your experience, what is your strategy of how to bring these really into the scenarios? So and given the context that the only figure that we lost in the SPM was the figure where we had regional information about investment opportunities in different countries. So we were not even able to keep that figure in the SPM, which is, I think, the least controversial among all different aspects that concern equity. But at the same time, we want to bring in very explicit ethical considerations about, who is going to pay for what, not only where is the mitigation happening, how can the IPCC bring this into its reports?
Thank you. And then over there, and then we go directly to the online questions, and you can prepare your responses.
Thank you very much. I'm Wolfgang Lutz. I'm a demographer at IIASA, and I was also involved in the population component of the SSPs. My first question was actually answered. It's about incorporating feedback from the climate into our future demographic trajectories, and I agree we should think hard how to incorporate this. My second question is really about the philosophy, the basic approach of Working Group 2. You talked a lot about limits to adaptation, but I still see lots and lots of studies that somehow assume that the climate of the future will meet societies of today, the public health capabilities of today, the proportion of subsistence farmers, but we know for sure that societies and economies are also changing. And there are forecasting models, like in our multidimensional population forecast by level of education, or also an analytic handle that is being used in the SSPs for trying to paint what could be the capabilities of future societies to cope with the climate of the time then. So how did you generally approach this issue in the Working Group 2?
Thank you. And then, Claudia, can you give us a question or two?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. One by Masahiro Sugiyama that just makes a plea to change the nomenclature from SSPXY to something else less confusing. But I actually have two questions from Sarita Vishwanathan. She says, what were the main challenges to work across the different working groups, and more importantly, if you could advise young researchers in the different areas on where to go, what to study next to facilitate this, what you would say?
Thank you. And then I think we then start with the responses here to the first question from the left side there on the lessons learned. I think that was for Jim mainly.
Yeah, there were two questions. Also, K1 ties into this as well, the question of bias, equity, and how you deal with regional issues. I mean, it seems to me that the way we deal with it, we are assessing literature, much of which comes out of model intercomparison projects that are funded with specific policy-relevant questions in mind. And I think we need to think about the policy-relevant questions that might draw out the use of a wider range of shared socioeconomic pathways. And I think that is the issue. And I think that's one for the IPCC workshop, which will probably have quite a heavy input of people from developing countries that can help to give that kind of perspective. And there you can imagine sort of running scenarios that do take note of a notion of historic responsibility, even if it's not accepted by governments. We still need to then assess it in IPCC. And just to nuance K1's point about what was unacceptable in the approval session, we could have got away with regional because we had 10 geographical regions. What sunk us was labeling some of them as developed and some of them as developing. That's what pulled us down. If we can keep it neutral and geographical, I think it's a lot easier to run it through and avoid some of the frankly political considerations that inhibited the approval of what I thought was one of the better figures in the SPM, quite frankly.
Thank you, Jim. And then there was a question to Working Group 2. Hans, can you respond to that, please?
Specifically on the societies of today being integrated in the current projections. Yes, if we would know the societies of the future, then I think we would have would do a better job. I don't think we have a clear picture of the societies of the future in the Working Group 2 report, but I would also like to express some warning to go too much into such visionary constructions, because this would need to consider hard limits of adaptation, which not only become clear for ecosystems, so there should be no sacrificing of ecosystems for the societies of the future, which may be more resilient, but also would like to ask to what extent we actually know what the resilience of human society actually is. Are we, considering that human civilization evolved during the Holocene, the last 11 to 10,000 years, human species populating every corner of the planet, now beginning to lose habitat, and we are facing hard limits with respect to adaptation capacity in the basic physiological patterns also for the human species during heat waves and heat-humidity combinations. And I would actually say we will be losing performance of society under future climate. There is no safe haven with a changed future climate for human society. That is the picture that I'm taking from the current assessment report. So there are, in that respect, also limitations involved. I would also like to refer to the equity question, which was actually also addressed in Working Group 2, and the picture that is emerging there, that the enabling for adaptation and mitigation is kind of a principal requirement for establishing equity, but that hasn't really been quantified. How many resources are needed to go into that with respect to transfer of technologies and finances into what we call the global south. So maybe the scenario workers can make some effort in that realm as well.
We have one final question from Claudia from the virtual participants, which Valerie would like to respond to.
I would like to first address a couple of other questions. Demography is the question coming back most frequently when doing outreach from the AR6, and there's no specific cross-working group box or anything that helps provide an integrated answer. And this could be seen as a gap. There was a question about, or a comment about education, and I think the AR6 reports flag as a whole the importance of climate change literacy, and I suspect our community is not sufficiently advanced in assessing climate change literacy, communicating that and flagging its importance, understanding the causes, implications, and potential actions. There's something there that is growing but not fully visible. And then regarding the challenges to work across working groups, as identified, it was an opportunity to start with special reports across the working groups so that we could work together from the very beginning. I also think that moving online due to the pandemic allowed to open our lead author meetings to authors from the other working groups. So in a way, what was a challenge turns to be an opportunity to be more open and strengthen the possibility to collaborate across working groups. It was also the case for some of the outreach material on regional or sectoral fact sheets as an opportunity to work better across working groups. Maybe it could be started earlier on in the process. I think that with Hans at the very beginning, we had the idea of having regional aspects treated as a special report that would be across working groups 1 and 2. It was not accepted by governments. I still think that it could be worth considering and expanding that to working group 3 through the geographical driven climate change constraints related to mitigation. There could be a potential to go beyond what is done there. And we still faced challenges for the sectoral chapters, I think, across working groups 1 and 2, for instance, where some of the integration or enhanced coordination could have taken place, but has not. I think it's also related to the limited number of authors and their availability to do this in addition to the work. And finally, for the young researchers, I always advise to have a look at the knowledge gaps, limits, final remarks part of each chapter in each report. That is also inspiring for looking at where cutting-edge research can help fill the gaps. And I want to flag one point. Some of the best review comments we have received for the Working Group 1 report were from coordinated reviews from early career scientist organizations. And I think it was also helpful for early career scientists to go in depth in reviewing specific chapters. So maybe there's a potential for your community also to organize that in the future.
Thank you, Valerie. And I think we have to end this part of this plenary and move to the next speakers. I saw a lot of hands, but what I can say is that we have 2 great days ahead of us with a lot of opportunities in the sessions to discuss these issues further. And there will be a session tonight, number 63, where we will discuss more about what we learned in AR6 and what we can bring forward to AR7. So thank you very much to the co-chairs, and thanks for very good questions. And I'm sorry that we didn't have more time for more questions and discussion. Thank you very much. So the next speaker now will be Paula Harrison, and she will give a presentation, and after that we will go directly to Detlef van Vuren, and after that we will take questions. If you have some brief clarifying questions, we can take that immediately after Paula's presentation. So please, Paula, tell us about the role of scenarios in IP-BESS assessments, please.
Thanks, Jan. So yeah, you just listened to a very fascinating panel discussion on the role of scenarios in the IPCC AR6 process. I'm going to introduce IP-BESS now and how we are using scenarios in the various IP-BESS assessments and how they relate to the SSPs. So just very quickly, I am sure there are some of you in the audience who are wondering what is IP-BESS or IP-BESS, as some people are saying, and it's IP-BESS, just to make sure everybody is clear. So IP-BESS is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It is an independent intergovernmental body, very similar to the IPCC, but with a focus on biodiversity. It's much younger. It was established by governments in 2012. It's just finished its first work program and started its second. But its mission is to strengthen the knowledge foundation for better policy through science, for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being, and sustainable development. So what has it best done so far? So far, we've already produced 8 assessments, and we have 3 ongoing assessments that are about to go to plenary. 2 will go to plenary literally in just over 2 weeks' time in Bonn. They're the values assessment and the sustainable use assessment, and 1 will go to plenary next year. Now, in terms of the assessments that have already produced, we had 4 regional assessments that were published in 2018, and then the global assessment that was published in 2019. All of those garnered a substantial amount of publicity, but perhaps of most relevance to this particular forum was the publication of a methodological assessment on scenarios and models of biodiversity and ecosystem services that was published in 2016. And I'll bring a few of the key findings out from that assessment report later in my presentation. But I also want to make note of the more recent IPBES IPCC workshop report that was also flagged up earlier on biodiversity and climate change. And this is a workshop report, so it's a bit different to an assessment report in that it doesn't go through a plenary approval process, but it marks a really important first step in IPBES and IPCC scientific communities working together on a joint report. So I'm just going to take you through a little bit about how scenarios have been used in past IPBES assessments, and then move on to how it is anticipated scenarios will be used in the assessments that are just starting in IPBES. So here I'm going to mainly focus on how scenarios have been used in the regional assessments and the global assessment that have been published in 2018 and 2019. So the 4 regional assessments took place in parallel, and all 4 assessments used a scenario archetype approach to try and synthesize and harmonize all the overwhelming existing scenario studies based on their underlying assumptions, their characteristics, and their narratives. And this allowed the very diverse assessment teams across the 4 regional assessments to look into their literature base, to look at the whole range of indirect and direct drivers that were of relevance to biodiversity and ecosystem services, and then to group them into common sets of scenario archetypes, which are the ones that we use were shown in the middle of the slide. They build on the Van Vuren et al. 2012 study, but adapt them slightly for the purposes of the assessments. The author teams were then able to go back into the literature to look for modeling studies under different scenarios per scenario archetype, and then come up with different estimations of impacts for agreed sets of impact indicators related to nature, how nature contributes to people, and how that then provides a good quality of life. And then this allowed the 4 assessments to, in a relatively consistent way, although there was diversity, to pull out some of those high-level key messages that we could then clearly communicate to decision makers in our summary for policymakers. And this table is just an example of the types of table you see in many SPMs, with lots of up and down arrows, different thickness of arrows, looking at the strength and confidence of the knowledge base that is behind those arrows, and for a whole range of indicators, which is the rows, and then for the 6 scenario archetypes, which is the columns. And again, that allowed us to make some really high-level messages that business as usual is deteriorating biodiversity and how it contributes to people, and that you really do need a balanced use across all of the nature's contributions categories. So not just focusing on material contributions, which is like food, feed, fiber, timber, but actually taking account of regulating contributions and non-material contributions that nature makes to people, and the importance of those sustainability, more positive scenarios for nature. What we found with the use of a scenario archetypes approach, and actually with most assessments, is you're very reliant on the existing evidence base of scenarios that is out there. And we really found out with the regional assessments, this was heavily influenced by the climate change scenario community. Given that the literature cut-off date for the regional assessments was 2017, most of our scenarios were SRES scenarios with a few first studies with the SSPs. So what we did for the global assessment was initiated a new intermodal comparison study for biodiversity and ecosystem services using the SSP RCP framework. And this was known as the Best Sim exercise. And here this used 10 global biodiversity models, 6 global ecosystem service models, and then applied them to 3 different combinations of SSPs and RCPs. And again, lots of publications came about from this exercise, and then the author teams were able to pull information out from those publications to come up with figures for the summary for policymakers. The one shown in this slide is just an extract, because you wouldn't have seen anything if I'd have put all of the regions in. So this is the extract for Africa. And here what you can see quite clearly is if you look at the top row, the global sustainability scenario, and here you can see again that we aligned the SSP RCPs that were used to the same scenario archetypes that were used in the regional assessments, again, so there was some cross-assessment coherence. But you can see in that top line that you basically are getting the least impacts on nature and nature's contributions to people from that global sustainability scenario. From the other 2 scenarios, you see very large purple bars, so you see much improvements in material contributions, but they are at the expense of biodiversity and regulating nature's contributions to people. And if you look at that top row, even though it's the least impacts, it is still negative for nature. So if you look at the orange bar, which is about species richness as the indicator for biodiversity, all of the columns are going down. So where are we currently now in terms of IPBES assessments and the role of scenarios? So here, this is where I just want to very quickly come back to the methodological assessment on scenarios and models and some of the key findings that came out from this assessment report. And again, this assessment report showed that scenarios are available and that they are very useful tools for policy support. But as we found out in the regional and global assessments, most of the scenarios that are out there are being developed for other purposes, and most of those purposes are for climate change, and it's probably highly related to the long history of the IPCC. A lot of those scenarios also describe negative scenarios. There are very few scenarios out there that are nature positive or sustainable futures, and that most of those global scenarios do lack a participatory approach. They're very expert driven and often by not a diverse set of worldviews. So what the assessment report concluded was that as a result, most of those global scenarios tend to be limited to assessing only impacts on nature, and they tend to be negative. But furthermore, also the policy and management options that relate to nature are not very well represented in the current scenario set. So, as a result of this, IPBES now has a task force on scenarios and models, and that's been working with the scientific community on the participatory development of the Nature's Futures framework. And the explicit aim of this framework is to create scenarios where that are centered on positive or desirable futures for nature and people. The underlying assumption behind the framework is that people will value nature much more in the future, but the reasons why they value nature, their value perspectives, can vary very widely depending on their worldview, their context, or their location. So the framework is depicted in this triangular figure, with each of the corner of the triangles representing an orientation to a different value perspective. So there we see at the top, we see a value perspective related to intrinsic values, known as the nature for nature perspective, and this is about making explicit space for nature in our landscapes and our seascapes. Then if we look in the bottom right-hand corner, we see instrumental values represented, our nature for society, value perspective, and this is the perspective very much where nature provides services to society through ecosystem services. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, we see relational values, or the nature as culture perspective. And this is very much seeing society being entwined with nature in collectively shaping cultural landscapes. And in between those very extreme versions of value perspectives, there is a continuum. And this is highlighting that those value perspectives are not mutually exclusive and that scenarios can exist anywhere in that space. It can also be considered as a nature's future frontier. And again, this is to emphasize that we need to develop pathways that go from today but move us towards these more sustainable, nature-positive futures, and that there are multiple versions of those sustainable futures. So again, I won't have much time to go into this in great detail, but the IPBES task force is now developing a toolbox that will help the scientific community to start to develop their own nature's futures scenarios. One aspect of that toolbox is a set of illustrative narratives, and there are 6 of these at different locations on the Nature's Futures triangle. And again, these are deliberately illustrative narratives because the framework is supposed to be not prescriptive, it's supposed to be heuristic that helps those involved in building scenarios to explicitly take account of recognizing, addressing the values in the scenarios that they are developing, and then themselves working out where they would position them in the triangle. That will then allow us to group scenarios that are in similar positions in those triangles into scenario families, similar to the scenario archetypes approach, to help the future assessment reports combine some of that information together. And again, not going to go into this in great detail, but the paper that will hopefully come out soon in Sustainability to Science will give some examples of how that can be used for different purposes. For example, if you were interested in land use and you want to create scenarios on a transect between a land sharing concept and a land sparing concept, you might position your scenarios along the axis shown. And there are similar examples for economic growth and for protected areas. And then just really quickly, another aspect of the toolbox is this definition of common features and specific features, where common features are those that are essential to all of the scenarios in the Nature's Futures framework because they are needed to have a nature-positive future, and the specific scenarios are those that you can relate to a specific value perspective in the framework. So here there is an example here on species conservation, where to have a positive future for nature, we would assume that all of those scenarios, most species that are currently threatened would be restored. But how you might then allocate your efforts in terms of conservation and restoration might be different depending on your value perspective. So if you are looking at a nature for society value perspective, you might focus on species diversity in agricultural landscapes where you're exploiting nature for society. Whereas in a nature as culture perspective, you might focus on flagship species, which are particularly important for your local community or for your indigenous people. So very last few remarks here is, so we already have a very well-used framework from the climate change community of SSPs and RCPs, and IPBES are now starting to develop these nature-centered scenarios. Do we really want those to develop on 2 separate trajectories? Are there certain circumstances where it makes sense to try and couple these 2 scenario frameworks together? And in my mind, the 2 assessments that have literally just started with IPBES, and I'm co-chairing the Nexus assessment, so I'm really keen to see coupled climate and biodiversity scenarios out in the literature, because these assessments will really need literature that is holistic, systemic, integrated assessments across sectors, across scales, and across multiple drivers, because that's the literature that we know is quite lacking and that we really would like you as a community to start providing. So this is just a few thoughts, and these are really initial thoughts that have just come out from an IPBES Scenarios and Models workshop that took place online in April, where we had a session where we had people from the climate change scenario community, working with people from the biodiversity community to start to think through, well, okay, what are the options for bringing these 2 frameworks together? And obviously to start with, it'd be really useful to just start mapping the scenario frameworks to each other, maybe not just SSPs and the NFF, but there's a whole range of community scenarios out there, and Detlef will tell you more about some of those other community scenario frameworks that are also being developed. But also, again, and I think it was highlighted by the IPCC panel, that there is only one really slightly positive maybe positive, sustainable scenario in the SSP current architecture? Should we be looking at a greater diversity of more sustainable and positive future scenarios? There may be variants on SSP1, there may be new entire scenarios within the architecture. We could see some of the other SSPs as disruptive scenarios on trying to develop our pathways to sustainable futures, to help stress test them, to how do we overcome obstacles. And we could also start to look at how can we bring in policy dimension into the SPAs, the shared policy assumptions that are specific to biodiversity. And again, what we'd really like to do at this workshop is start this discussion. This is just some first initial suggestions. Please come to session 59 if you want to discuss them further, because that's a workshop session where we're particularly focusing on coupling climate and biodiversity scenarios. So I'm going to really just skip through my concluding remarks. These are much more on a personal level, particularly me having my head of the Nexus assessment, in that I really think we should be embracing complexity. We should be ensuring that our communities are talking to each other so that we're fostering collaboration across climate change, biodiversity, sustainable development goals, and we really need to do that if we're going to actually inform the relevant policy processes out there. And I will leave it at that and just say thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paula. And if there are one or two questions for clarifying, yeah, I see Hans Portner, please. And then Detlef, you can come and get ready for your presentation. A question from Hans. Do we have a microphone for Hans? Or you can stand up and...
Yeah, thanks a lot for this nice overview. I was wondering whether this Nature Futures framework can actually be useful without considering climate change. Is climate change being considered, or will there be a later add-on to that?
Yeah, so no, I think, so climate change is being considered. I think it's almost impossible to look at biodiversity without climate change. And hence the Nexus assessment is those interlinkages between biodiversity, climate change, food, water, and health. But yes, I think the discussion is when we're looking at the toolbox in terms of what's a common feature and what's a specific feature, is where it would be really nice to bring this conversation, because in our mind, a common feature for almost all Nature's Futures framework scenarios would be that you'd have to be RCP 2.6 or 1.9 as a maximum, because otherwise you're nowhere are you going to get to a nature positive or sustainable future. So I think that's where we start to bring in the conversation, and we have to, again, start to think about how we would couple things together to develop some of those pathways that allow transformation to be explored in moving towards these futures.
Thank you. I see no more hands, and I think we can move on to Detlef. Thank you, Paula. You can sit down here on the panel and be ready for the Q&A afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you.
Please, Detlef.
Yeah, so this presentation was originally simply had the title, anything on community scenarios that is not IPCC or IPBES, so all the other community scenarios. But I will also add something on the update of the SSP-RCP framework. Yeah, so the this paper on the characterizations of different scenarios in the literature has been mentioned already a couple of times before. What we did in 2012 was looking at a whole range of different assessments, and then looking at scenario developments, and then see whether we could identify certain common storylines. And we identified 6 storylines that were in many of these assessments. And the slide that I already showed on the previous scenario forum is that you can map partly the SSPs on this framework. And so SSP1, SSP5, SSP3, and SSP2 have a very, very clear position. For SSP4, it's slightly less clear. That's also why in Paula's presentation, when she was showing the IPBES, they added this additional group of inequity scenarios, which is the theme of SSP4. But there's also something clear that there is this corner on the right bottom, which is these regional sustainable development scenarios, maybe also degrowth, which is not really emphasized yet in the SSP RCP framework. Now, so I was going to say something on the assessments that have used scenarios. I could have also looked into many existing projects that are looking into scenarios. And so many projects are developing new scenarios. For instance, the EDITS project is looking into the role of lifestyle and demand. Engage has been looking into different timing of CDR use and in relation also to peak warming. There are other scenarios looking into behavior. The Engage project now is also, for instance, looking into inequity. Because there are so many, I will concentrate myself simply to the assessments. And so one assessment that has been using scenarios is IPBES, but that is already covered by Paula. Then the Global Biodiversity Outlook has been published in 2020 with an overall for scenarios. The Global Environmental Outlook was published in 2019. The Global Land Outlook was published this year. The NGFS, which is looking into climate finance, has been using scenarios published last year. Obviously, IPCC has been using scenarios. I have some slides on the use of IPCC of the scenarios. I didn't know exactly how much was covered in the previous session. I will quickly go through those. The nitrogen assessment was looking into a set of scenarios which are partly SSP-based. The SHAPE project I would like to point out. It is a project, but I make an exception here simply because the scenarios are quite interesting to look at. And then the Global Resource Outlook, for instance, from IRP. It might easily be that I have not covered all the assessments, so let me know later if I did not. Also, in the slides that I will be presenting, I'm giving a little bit of my own interpretation. I was not involved in many of these assessments, so I might sometimes not completely do well in representing them, so let me know as well if I did. So first of all, the Global Biodiversity Outlook. And so the Global Biodiversity Outlook in previous occasions has used really quantified scenarios, and quite similar to this one as well, where they looked into a baseline and then into measures that could potentially move us from a negative trend into a positive trend. Now clearly this is inspired by some work that, for instance, the image team did, but especially also the paper from David Leclerc on bending the trend. And in the most recent outlook, it's much more a qualitative representation, but it does show you how they are looking at scenarios, which is how can we make a change from a baseline into a positive future. Actually, that's exactly the same in the Global Environmental Outlook of UNEP. They also try to emphasize this possible negative trend if you would follow a baseline scenario. They are using SSP2 for this, and then how you could make a difference and possibly move towards meeting the SDGs, and they describe a different pathway that could actually do this. And the Global Land Outlook, if it comes, yes, does do exactly the same. It also provides a vision of the future. Again, it's an SSP2-based vision, and then look into different measures that can be taken for restoration and prevention to move from a world where we are degrading land into a more positive vision. And so you can see that most of these scenarios want to tell a particular story of a baseline scenario and then making a change, which for them forces them into a framework where they take an SSP2 scenario and then describe how to make that change. IPCC has been using scenarios. We have heard quite a bit in the last hour, so I will quickly go through that. In working group 1, the whole scenario framework was used, and actually in a similar way as we probably were envisioning when we were developing the SSP-RCP framework. Working group 2 has emphasized the role of climate, for instance, in terms of the global warming levels, and also the role of development, but it's not really using explicitly the SSP-RCP framework. I think when we were developing originally the SSP-RCP framework, we actually had Working Group 2 very much in mind as a client that could really use this with the development and climate access. And so I think that we would have imagined a much stronger use of this framework originally in the Working Group 2 report. And now it's used not so very systematically. There are some examples where it's used, as shown earlier. And then Working Group 3, where the emphasis is pretty much on mitigation. And as a result, and this was also shown earlier by Jim, it's not really systematically going through the SSP-RCP framework, and I will show this as well. And so this was already shown. How have we looked at the literature? We simply are in the hands of the literature, so we build up this database. In the database, there are lots of papers that look into SSP2, and simply because they are looking in at a particular set of mitigation challenges. I think there's a little bit of feedback, but I don't know exactly what is causing that. Yeah, so then so we took that database. The database has certain characteristics. We characterized all the scenarios in terms of their temperature outcome. And the majority is SSP2 based, simply because many papers are looking into the question, how can we move from a baseline into different, more climate safe futures along different ways of mitigation. And so the emphasis is on mitigation. And in those papers, also looking into different socioeconomic uncertainties is not the main focus. But that does lead into this bias. And so if we summarize it, so SSP1, the SSP matrix was used in Working Group 1. Working Group 2 has especially the global warming levels as an entry. And in Working Group 3, there's a lot of current policies and then trying to compare that to mitigation challenges. So in summary, it means that we have a lot of scenarios looking into SSP2, and in the axis going downwards to SSP2, we have a little bit in SSP1. We, after that, looked into all the scenarios that were in the database and looked whether we could see a particular, that might be the reason, whether there was a particular reason, way that they were reducing the emissions. And so from the whole set, we selected a set of illustrative mitigation pathways that move down in a particular way. So for instance, using a lot of renewables or demand change or, for instance, negative emissions. One of them actually was this alignment with sustainable development, which is the SSP1 scenario. And the nice thing is that we could use it to also illustrate how you could actually go down to net zero in different ways. And just to point out, there is this IMP NEC, which is going to net zero, but with positive emissions being compensated by negative emissions. But there is also this IMP low demand, where demand change, especially lifestyle change, does really also get to that, but with much less negative emissions. And so the IMPs can be used to illustrate different pathways, while normally in the SSP-RCP matrix, you would just simply go down a column in a particular way. Yeah, the SHAPE project, as I assessed, I wanted to emphasize that one, because it's really looking into narratives that are consistent with sustainable development. It's asking itself, how can I achieve sustainable development goals? And again, it's thinking of 3 different pathways to achieve that. One would be by economic innovation, one would be by resilient communities, and one would be by managing the global commons. And then we have developed in that project different narratives that are consistent with these 3 different ways of achieving the SDGs. They all took SSP1 as a starting point, but then started to revise it. For instance, also in terms of economic development. And so one of these scenarios, the resilient communities, where we also started to change the economic assumptions of that scenario and made it into a post-growth scenario. Now I would move to the last part of my presentation, which is the SSP-RCP framework. And I would like to emphasize that there are four levels of ambition if you want to think of updates of the scenario framework. Yeah, so the easiest is we realize that things over time have gone different than we actually projected. So maybe take the whole exercise and restart in 2022. We take the historical period, the historical data, we take the growth rates of the original scenarios, just put them on top of it. Then at least the starting point is where we are in reality, in history. And we can, for instance, put the COVID period into this exercise. And the second thing is that you also might have realized that some of our expectations of the futures have changed as a result of the events of the past, because of COVID, because of the current situation, for instance, in the world. And so you would like to also maybe update the projections themselves. The third thing is that we had made narratives, qualitative stories of each of these SSPs, RCP, for each of these SSPs. And there too, you might want to think, are these stories still relevant? Can I also update these stories? And then obviously at some point we have to also replace the total framework. The framework was made for a certain purpose. And just as SSP RCP framework replaced the SREF framework, at some point also this is not relevant anymore. But these are community scenarios, and as Bas pointed out in his presentation, we have to think a little bit of what is actually the pace that you want to change things if you want to take the whole community with you. And so maybe base year updates can happen frequently, but updates of projections, maybe only every few years. IPCC cycles, question mark. The narratives, maybe even less frequently, and replacing the total framework. Yeah, also there you don't want to do that very often. And so just a quick few things. There are many presentations related to this on the conference. There is the session 17 on GDP and population updates. There's the session 202 on improving the scenario development process. There's the session 16 on CMIP 6 and 7. And there's session 48 on feasibility. And so this is, I'm not going to discuss this in detail. Tim already gave a lot of history lessons. Basically, the scenarios were made in 2012, also in quantitative sense. So they are getting old now. And so that's why we started the process where we thought, okay, we can first of all do that very first update. And so that has already been done. Some people have taken the historical data and put the old projections on top of that. We did it as individual image team, but PIC also did it and shared it with as a community result. But now moving to level 2, can we rethink our current projections? And so we are working with the same teams that made the original projections. And so the OECD team, led by Rob Delling, and the population team, led by Wolfgang Lutz and Samir Kessi. And we are going through reasons why these projections are changed. And so, for instance, for population, COVID has happened. There is the Syrian and Ukraine crisis. There is changes in outlook for fertility. And so they are running the demographic models again, also improve demographic models, and get new outcomes. And one thing to notice is that in the new projections, population has shifted upwards. And so instead of peaking at 9.4 to 9.7 billion, the scenarios might now peak actually at 10 billion. And the same is true for the economic projections. And so Rob Delling is working with his team in doing the economic modeling, and thanks, they see also the COVID crisis and make new projections. The scenarios will be therefore at a lower point, simply as a result of COVID, but also at some point we might also take the current political situation into account in this. Now, in this session 17, they will discuss this in detail. 2 slides more, Jan. One is, at some point we have to think through the whole system and see how to change it. And that will be quite fundamental. There might be 2 small changes that we have to think of maybe. And one is this SSP RCP frame matrix in terms of challenges to adaptation, challenges to mitigation. Obviously that is framed in a way that is mostly relevant for climate. maybe if we simply reframe it a little bit, we can make it slightly more relevant also for other communities, realizing that this is simply about, are you preventing global environmental change, or are you adapting to it? And maybe different words could make it slightly more relevant for other communities. And the second thing is to realize that we have different ways of moving down the columns. And when I was going through all these projects, this is actually where most projects are focusing on. And how can you move from a baseline scenario downwards in different ways? Now, we had it in the framework in terms of SPAs, but maybe we have to do much more there and to bring that into the framework. So SSPs are used extensively. We saw that this morning. And it is important because we get this common scenario pool, which allows for a comprehensive assessment. But we also see that there is much more emphasis now on the transformation pathways, which means that there's much less emphasis on the baseline uncertainty, and people are more often using these SSP2 plus variants. There's also much more emphasis on lifestyle change and degrowth variants, which we might want to take account of. Obviously, each of these assessments have to make a choice, a trade-off between generic scenarios and very specific scenarios. Do we take this, go on the bandwagon of IPCC and use all those quantifications, or do we develop something ourselves? And you see that different assessments make different choices. And there is a time now for updates, and for population and GDP, they will be available soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Detlef, and thank you, Paula. And then my question is to Bas, how much time do we have for questions now?
Yeah, we're really eating into our own lunch. But yeah, let's do about 3 questions or so, and then
3 questions.
Try to keep it to 5 minutes.
Then we open the floor for 3 well and clear questions. Please, I see a hand there, and I see Claudia, and then 1 hand there. Okay, please, you're first. A microphone to the...
Shin Asayama from National Institute for Environment Studies, Japan, and thank you. And I want to ask a question to Detlef. So I'm wondering about the geopolitical dimension of the scenario storylines, and I think particularly the Russian invasion of Ukraine completely changed our assumptions and views on how future international relations will evolve. So my question is, how current 5 different SSP scenarios narratives captured this fundamental change of geopolitics? Do you think SSP 3 or 4 will well capture this future narratives, or do you think we need have new scenarios, specific scenarios? Thanks.
Thank you. And then Claudia from the...
Somebody from online, Marina Baldissera Pacchetti, asks a question to Paula. She says, the humanities, in particular the environmental humanities, do a lot of conceptual work on the human nature distinction and the role of values in modeling. To what extent have you been engaging with the humanities, and do you think there is a future for more cross-disciplinary collaboration, specifically across sciences and humanities?
Thank you. And there was a 3rd hand down there somewhere. It's Matthias, please. And then we will have answers from Paula and Detlef. Please, Matthias.
Yeah, thanks. I also have a question, Detlef, for you. The one slide you showed where we might need to get more serious about the policy assumptions to get more policy relevant. I would like to tease you a little bit. Do you think that's the way forward, or do we need to get more serious about the shared policy assumptions, superimposing the SSPs? We had that challenge quite a bit in Working Group 2, where indeed we try to come across with adaptation scenarios where the literature actually, if you take the SSP framework series, is talking about challenges to adaptation, or how you respond to these challenges. If you go into global finance of adaptation and so forth, it's a different story. So I think there could be 2 approaches forward. Changing the scenario axis, bringing the policy in, or getting more serious about the superimposition of policy on top. So I would like to get your views on that. That would be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthias. And then over to Paula and Detlef. You will respond.
Okay, I'll go first because mine's probably more straightforward than Detlef's answer. So Excellent question from online, and it's something we have been considering a lot in the best task force on scenarios and models. We do have people from the social sciences and humanities within the task force, but the Nature's Futures framework went out for external review as well in September, October last year, and part of that, as well as a series of workshops with the national focal points, were a series of workshops with the research communities, and we had one specifically addressing the social sciences and humanities, and we're really keen again to continue that collaboration and engagement.
Thank you. And then there was a question from Detlef.
Ukraine question first. Yeah, so at least in the framework we have the SSP3 scenario, which has some elements of what we currently see happening. It's relatively early to really make sense of what is now going to, how this is going to make our outlook differently. So either you are in an exercise where you specifically would like to speculate a bit and then you might develop your new scenarios. Otherwise, I think for now the SSP3 scenario makes a lot of sense as a way to explore what these kinds of futures might entail. And then obviously in a few years we should be thinking a bit about how this might impact the overall framework. The second question, yeah, so I would actually say that at this point of time, your second approach makes the most sense, which is to take the framework as it is and really think of different policies and different pathways to move down as different SPAs, if you like, in moving down. But it might be much more important not to take one particular pathway as we did in the past, and we had one specific SPA per SSP column, but consider much more diversity in each of these columns.
Thank you, and I think we have to end the session now, and thank you very much to the presenters, and thank you very much for your questions, and I look forward to the sessions where we can discuss further. And then I give the floor to Bas before we break for lunch. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Three short housekeeping issues. One, we found a hotel key here, probably from Hotel Daniel. Check your keys whether you have it. Lunch will be on the terrace behind the oval room here in the back, so go either outside or through the hallways. And find your way when you go to the parallel sessions. I urge all of the session organizers to start at 2:30 sharp, just no delays there, after the lunch break, and be back here tonight for the poster session here in the foyer and the main building at 6. And reception, so you can socialize into the evening. Enjoy lunch.